Hey guys, welcome back to Pistons Talk podcast. I have a very special guest on today's show. You probably have seen him over at the Detroit Free Press's YouTube channel on the Pistons Pulse podcast, where he is the host with him and Amari Sankofa. You've also probably seen him on the Game Theory podcast with Sam Vecini, where they break down the NBA draft and prospects. We have Motor City Hoops on today. What's up, man?
What's up? How are you doing today? Thank you for having me. We were just talking. We haven't got to just talk one-on-one a lot. Obviously, we talk, Twitter DMs and stuff like that and on Twitter, but this might be the first time, even though we've shared podcasts together, where it's just you and I, we get to go back and forth and talk about this Detroit Pistons season, off-season, NBA draft, a big couple months for this organization.
For sure, for sure. Before we do jump into the podcast, I always like to give any kind of guest that I have on the floor. So if you have anything you want to promote, plug,
Sure.
social media, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so just at Motor City Hoops on Twitter, guys. If you're not following, would sure appreciate it and love it. Everything I do goes through there in terms of I do have a Substack that's entirely dedicated to Detroit Pistons. So you can find my Substack on there. I put scouts on the Basketball Bulletin Substack, but again, I don't want to throw out all those things. If you follow Motor City Hoops on Twitter, you'll find all those stuff. I've learned to be pretty good self-promoting all of the content I put out. So
Oh, dude, you're good. You're good. I do have your Twitter in the description below, so people can click on your Twitter. They'll take it straight to your Twitter so they can follow you. I also have the Detroit Free Press, which you have to talk to them because I was going up in their playlist.
okay.
And they have all the podcasts from the Lions to the Michigan, but they don't have the Pistons Pulse in a playlist with all the other podcasts. I'm like,
Yeah.
what's going on there?
I don't know. The YouTube situation there is still a little bit weird because at one point we were the only thing putting out stuff on YouTube, and we are still the only one that's putting out lives. So I don't know if because we're essentially the only thing in the live tab that they just leave it there. Yeah, I don't know. We're still hashing some of that stuff out. I pushed really hard. We pushed really hard for them to let us start doing those. And so we kind of led the charge with that. So we're still hashing some of that stuff out as some of the other Free Press podcasts are now getting into the more video portion of things.
Hey, man, you started a trend, you started the wave, and,
I guess
everyone has a visual podcast now. Who knew?
I was just talking to somebody about this. I do not watch podcasts on YouTube. I never have. I don't know that I ever will. I don't really understand it. But if you're not on YouTube with a podcast, you're missing out on, I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but it seems like this is the spot for a lot of people to, take in their podcasts and their content.
Hey, man, I appreciate it. I mean, I didn't know I was doing podcasts. I was doing live streams, like maybe like during COVID was when I first started getting on YouTube. I was like, they're like, dude, you're doing a podcast. I'm like, doesn't feel like a podcast. I'm just talking basketball, sounding crazy. But we got a good show for you guys. A lot of NBA draft stuff, Pistons stuff. But I did want to leave off with some breaking news, obviously.
Yeah.
There was a new assistant coach hired, Fred Vincent. I wanted to know, like, what have been your initial thoughts so far with the hiring? Do you like this hiring? Do you think this is a coach that the Pistons desperately needed maybe last year?
Or for the last 3 or 4 years? Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Here's what I've learned about coaching hires, even front office hires. It's even more of a crapshoot than player evaluations and NBA draft evaluations, even free agent signings and trades where we think we understand the value, but we never really know until things play out. I think we know even less about coaches and what their impact is because so much of that goes on behind the scenes. Sure, we can read body language on a sideline and but even how a team executes on the floor, sometimes that is the players. So I have taken the path of I try not to evaluate these things too much. What I will say is I like the idea behind this. I like the process of bringing in what is considered a shooting coach to this organization. This seems to be what he is known for in his specialty. And there's some guys on this team that could really use that. And so if he's as good as what it sounds like he is, I'm all for this. And it makes a ton of sense.
For sure. I know some people, I was scrolling on the timeline on Twitter and someone's like, well, I guess we're drafting Red Holland. They're already speculating because this guy is supposed to be like the shot doctor, the shot guru, which we'll get into some prospects later. But I think this is a good hire personally. given the lack of 3-point makes that the Pistons have had over the past couple of seasons, I think they were like almost like 20th or almost dead last in 3-point like makes last season. Not to say that they didn't shoot them, they just weren't going in.
Yeah, I mean, I was pulling up Basketball Reference because this is one of the stats I do. They were 26th in percentage, 27th in attempts, 29th in makes. Like it just, that's some of the numbers about the Pistons this last season was they didn't shoot the three well. They turned the ball over a lot. They fouled the other team a whole bunch and put them on. Like those to me are floor raising stats if you can improve them. And they were bad in all of those kind of floor stats, I guess, which just the base level, you got to be better in those areas. And hopefully along with talent and acquisition, player acquisition, maybe Fred Vincent can help improve at least one of those things also.
For sure. I mean, I was looking back. I think the last time that the Pistons had like a quote unquote like shooting coach was like David Hoopla, which people know who that was. He used to be Michael Jordan's shooting coach because Van Gundy had him on the roster for maybe like a year or two, and they were like close to top 10 in 3-point makes. Which I mean, if you can get like, I'm not saying we're going to go from like, 30th to like 10, but I mean, if you can go middle of the pack, I think maybe instead of 14 wins, maybe you're closer to 20. You never know.
Well, I think there's going to be, I would assume there's personnel decisions that help with the 3-point shooting this as well. I also, I don't know this for a fact. I do wonder if this is somewhat of a Monty Williams thing as well. I don't know Monty Williams' history enough to know where his teams have ranked in the league in terms of 3-point attempts and makes and all of that. Maybe they didn't shoot very many because Monty knew that they didn't have good shooters. But I think this needs to be an organizational focus in terms of you have to space the floor. We're seeing it right. The Celtics have run the league all year long, regular season, now throughout the postseason, without one of their best players. And part of that is because they can really space the floor and shoot it. And I'm not saying Detroit's ever going to get close to that, in the near future, but they have to start making strides towards valuing the floor spacing that shooting provides.
I mean, even a few years ago, I was looking back, like, I think it was maybe Dwayne Casey's first or second year, they were like 11th in 3-point makes. Not saying it's impossible. I mean, if you get the right personnel, like you said, I'm not going to speculate like a lot of people in the chat are right now about Monty Williams' job security. I think that's the $1 million question that nobody knows. Obviously, if we heard anything, it'd probably be out. Like Amari would be tweeting it, James would be tweeting it, Woj would be tweeting it. We don't know. We don't know if Monty's staying. This is just a shooting coach. It's an assistant shooting coach. We really don't know because I know a lot of people are asking right now. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea. I'm staying out of this entirely. I do want to say I would like to think you would want this decision made by the draft because in some ways you do want to draft a player that's going to make sense with the head coach and your head coach's vision. One thing, at least I've talked about, is feeling like this organization had a couple different paths, that not everybody had the same vision for what the team should look like. And your head decision maker, which is Trajan Langdon now, and your head coach, which for right now, for all we know, is Monty Williams, need to be on the same page. Maybe they're trying to figure that out. If they haven't figured it out, I wonder if that means, hey, maybe it's time to move on because they've had plenty of time to figure out if they could or not. I don't know. I also, there's part of me like, don't you want to go ahead and move on and find the next guy and get on the same page with him before the draft? So it's it's been very, very interesting.
I'll just say, like, to kind of piggyback off your point, like the press conference, I feel like you want to kind of have a blank canvas, like a clean slate. Like, how some like reporters are that aren't like on the beat, like a day to day, like the radio guys, if you will. They're going to rip Trajan apart if Monty's still here. I guarantee you that there's going to be at least a 97.1 reporter or somebody saying like why bring Monty back? But we're going to have to wait and see what happens.
I do assume that's why we haven't seen a press conference from Trajan. Is he can't go into that press conference not knowing 100% one way or the other. Even if he's 95%, he can't go into that press conference because 80% of those questions are going to be about Monty Williams and the head coach and what, why or why not. And especially if it's 50-50 right now for some reason, I don't, who knows what the hang up would be or the discussions. And I'm not saying I don't know any of this. I always like to preface this. Yes, I do a podcast with Omari. Omari never tells me anything that he doesn't tell you guys. I find out at the same time as all of you on Twitter whenever I know James Edwards. We text back and forth. James doesn't tell me anything either. I find out news the same way you guys. I think there's other content creators who have intel and connections way beyond. I have no direct, relationships into the organization. So this is just me speculating and guessing. And my guess is that's why we haven't seen a press conference. Is you have to have these decisions made before you put Trajan in front of the media.
I mean, plus it's Father's Day this weekend. I mean, that would be like a really classless move to fire somebody like on Father's Day. Like it just would. Like maybe we'll get some news next week. I don't really think we're going to get anything like crazy in terms of like coaching decisions, front office decisions. I mean, there are reports that they wanted to hire Dennis Lindsey in the front office, and he was a finalist with Trajan Langdon. I don't really think this organization knows what they want to do yet, and they're just kind of evaluating everyone, seeing like who's going to be here, who's not. And I think that is a safe and approach way to do things, but I mean, can't really knock them. I mean, he just won 14 games last season, so everything's on the table.
Yeah, and I will say I like the idea of new decision maker at the top. I like the idea of making that one person, and whether Trajan is good or not, I have no idea. I'm cautiously optimistic, but just like I said at the beginning, I don't know. Like, I know people can go back and say, oh, the front office he was a part of drafted this guy and that guy and made this trade and that trade. We don't know if he was making those decisions or not. We don't know who was in his ear if he was the one making those decisions, and if those people will still be around him in Detroit. So at the end of the day, I don't think we know a lot what goes on behind the scenes. And so it is a little bit of blind faith. But I think the idea of somebody new, a new fresh set of eyes making these decisions makes sense. And we've seen him hire a few other guys in the front office. And now he has to decide, is Monty going to be on the same? That's the most important thing to me. Does Monty have the same vision for the roster as Trajan? Because no matter what you think about Monty, no coach is going to be at their best if their vision for a team doesn't meet the roster that is put together by the GM. So either they need to get on the same page or the Pistons need to find a new coach.
I think you just hit that straight out of the park, and there's nothing I can add. That's why I brought you on, man. You're one of the best in the business. I fucking love it. I love it, man. I could talk ball with you all day. Now, I wanted to ask you a similar question about the Detroit Pistons and just like your biggest takeaways from this past season, just a 30,000 foot view of them going 2-1 and then going 2-28, setting the losing record.
They weren't actually 2-1. That was an alternate universe, right? They didn't actually win 2 of their first 3 games and have us excited. That didn't actually happen, right?
Oh, it happened. I was on this was a Dan Burke Pro podcast.
Oh my gosh, man. That seems like so long ago. I think part of my overview is what we talked about earlier. This team has to get better at the foundational things. The modern NBA requires you to make outside shots and provide floor spacing. The modern NBA requires you to not turn the ball over at near worst league, the near bottom of the league. You can't foul and put the other team on they're not winning on the margins in any of these areas, and they have to improve in those. I think the other thing I take away is you either have to hitch your wagon to Cade Cunningham or completely restart and rebuild all over. I don't have the stomach or appetite for that. I do believe in Cade Cunningham. So let's find out who Cade wants to be, find out what you think Cade is, and let's start building that out around him. And does Jaden Ivey fit with that? Yes or no? Does Jalen Duren, does Asar Thompson, on down the line? And if they do, keep them. If they don't, maybe a consolidation trade is in the works. And then the other thing is, I agree with everybody that Monty Williams was not a great coach this year. I would never defend that, but I think it's sometimes what gets lost in Monty not being a good coach is this was not a good roster either. And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that Monty not being great, Troy not being great, the roster not being great, all of that contributed to 14 wins, but all of them were factors, including a poorly built roster that only slightly got better at the deadline. Like, I think that was maybe the best single like portion of a calendar year that Troy had. I like the trades he made. I like Simone Fontecchio. We'll see if the Grimes move. I like the process of it, the idea of it, but he obviously wasn't great in the 6 games that he played. They have to get on the same page, and they have to start building out a foundational roster that makes sense around your number 1 pick, who you're probably giving a rookie max extension this offseason.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said is like what I have said on this podcast. Like, I was asking for a veteran center going into the last season.
Yeah, and that's a great call by you. I did not see that. I had other people bring that up to me. You were obviously one of them. And that's a great vision from someone like you to see that, because it wasn't an area I saw.
Yeah, like the Taj Gibson move, I thought should have been made last summer. Now, obviously, last free agency, there was more of a player pool. There was more players that maybe, I know people get hung up on the Cam Johnsons, the Grant Williams, the PJ Washington, stuff like that. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm saying they kind of just sat free agency out last year.
Yep.
Like, they traded for a guy in Joe Harris that was coming off a serious calf injury and expected him to get back to form. That didn't happen. The Monte Morris stuff was really weird. He was healthy, then he wasn't. I'm not going to question a medical doctor because I'm not one, but that whole situation and process was weird. But to your point, I love the trades. Like, Simone Fontecchio, I think, is very underrated. He doesn't get talked about enough. He could easily become a 20-point per game scorer next to Cade Cunningham. He really could. He's that good. The Quentin Grimes stuff, I'm kind of on the fence. I just kind of looking at his numbers, like, kind of seemed like he peaked in his second year, and he's just kind of struggled with injuries ever since then. I'm hoping he can have a good season going into this summer, but I just think the season as a whole, he didn't really bring a whole lot, didn't really give Monty a whole lot to work with, and I think fans expected playoffs right off the bat.
I will backtrack just a little bit. I do want to quite the process of that trade. The idea of a Quentin Grimes type player makes sense. Where I want to backtrack a little bit is they probably didn't get the value out of Bojan Bogdanovic that they should have. That's where I'll say that. And that was a mistake made last offseason or the deadline before. I'm just saying I like the idea in the process of the players they acquired in terms of what Fontecchio should be, what Quentin Grimes could be. And we have seen Quentin Grimes be that guy in the league on a good NBA team. Now, to your point, did he peak? Is it straight regression now? Is it injuries? Whatever. I will also say Monte Morris made sense. It just never materialized in the way that you had hoped, because what have we talked about? Offensively, this team didn't space the floor and they turned the ball over a lot. You know what Monte Morris does? He makes threes and doesn't turn the ball over. We just never saw it actually happen in Detroit. In the same way, like we said, Quentin Grimes, what's he supposed to do? Make threes and defend. If you told Pistons fans you were getting a kid that could do that, you'd be pretty excited. We just didn't see him do it in the 6 games that we saw. And so that, Fontecchio was the one that I think came in and did play above expectations, or at least to expectations. But I said this the other day. What I think is nice for Fontecchio is he gets to play in a role that he is suited for. I think a lot of guys on this roster are being asked to play in roles 1 or 2 spots above what they're actually capable of. And while I've warmed up a little bit more to star hunt a little bit, go get a bucket getter to put on this team to allow everybody else to settle into more reasonable roles.
Yeah, I think I know I'm going completely off topic, but my biggest issue with the Pistons over the past couple of years is they draft role players and then ask the role players to
1,000%.
Like Sadiq Bey is
a great point.
Sadiq Bey is a perfect example, right? Sadiq Bey coming out of college was just a catch and shoot 3-point specialist, like one of the best out of his draft class. The Pistons said, "Hey, how about you become a 3-level scorer?" Which was not part of his game, and he was playing out of position.
Be Chris Middleton, like that. That was a 5% chance outcome, probably.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's been their biggest issue, probably my entire Pistons fandom. I mean, I've been watching the Pistons since like the Grant Hill era. Like, they just try to trap these role players and like try to say, oh, you're going to be like the star player. It's just like, no, like play to where their strengths are at. And they just haven't done that yet.
Asar Thompson should be the 5th option offensively right now in his career. And then then it'd be like, hey, look what he does defensively, rebounding, and then he just play finishes. I say this about Isaiah Stewart. I think Isaiah Stewart is a good NBA basketball player. He's not a starter. I don't think Isaiah Stewart is a starter in the NBA. I think fans would like Isaiah Stewart if he was the first big coming off the bench that played 75% of his minutes at the 5, 25% of his minutes at the 4 against certain matchups. Hey, you know what? Isaiah Stewart shoots 36% from 3 off the bench for the Pistons. I think people would think that's a pretty good player, but trying to start him at the 4 with a non-space lineup to begin with, and now everybody hates him because he's in a role that he's not ready for and not equipped for, not talented enough for. So that's why I think talent acquisition is so important. Let's put these guys in roles that they can actually be successful in.
100%. I mean, Isaiah Stewart to me is just a standstill 3-point shooter.
100%. Yeah.
And then they try to ask him to be this movement shooter and make decisions that he's just not comfortable with yet in his development. I mean, he's an underrated passer, but I don't think he's ready to put the ball on the floor and go to the cup. I just don't.
And not whenever you have the other guys around him on the roster. Like you play him with Jalen Duren, who's a non-floor space. Like it just – and this is no knock on these guys individually. And of course they're young. I can hear people screaming, Duren's only 20, Asar's only I get it. I'm just saying, I just don't know that that's what's best for their progression when we're asking them to do so much so early. And I think a big fault of that, sure, you want to blame the coaching staff. I get it. I understand it. Let's put it a little bit on the players. They have to develop as well. Like they have to put in the work. That's part of them. But I think it's also just sheer roster construction, not having floor spacers, not having a guy that can go get buckets and those type of things where now all of a sudden you need Sadiq Bey to be a 25-point a game night a couple years into his career. And what's your thoughts on this? Listen, the Bruce Brown trade was awful, right? We can all agree. Awful process. Brutal process. But every time I think of Bruce Brown in Detroit, I envision him being asked to be like a star, number 1, number 2, number 3 option, and Pistons fans being upset with him because he's not good enough to be in that role. Like Bruce Brown was awesome in Denver because he was the 4th or 5th option on that team and just got to do the things he was great at. So again, awful trade. I'm not condoning the trade. I'm just saying, I wonder what it would have looked like in Detroit when he was asked to be in a role that wasn't just this connective tissue type of player.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Bruce Brown because I was calling them the Detroit Nuggets.
Yeah,
because they had all of our role players. They had Ish Smith. They had Reggie Jackson. Like Detroit for
KCP.
KCP. Detroit for all the crap they get for draft misses. They know how to draft good role players.
No, so sorry, go ahead. I'll let you finish.
No, I'm good. You can go ahead.
I was on the Athletic NBA show. It just dropped today. If you guys want to go listen, we talked a lot of Pistons NBA draft, and we did some Pistons draft trivia, draft/Pistons. Don't hate on me too much for not knowing all the answers. But one of the questions was Pistons players that have been drafted since 2004 that have won championships on other teams. And the answers were Middleton, Bruce Brown, and KCP. Well, 2 of those guys were drafted in the 2nd round. The Pistons drafted 2 dudes in the 2nd round that have gone on to be major players and starters at the very least on NBA championship teams. And so it is funny that they've drafted some good players, role players to an extent, but good players. The Pistons haven't been able to reap the benefits of those draft picks because they haven't been able to get the stars to put them in the necessary roles.
Yeah, it's literally like the $1 million question. Like, why are the Pistons in the situation that they're in? And you give, fans the answer and they don't like the answer. I don't know if it's they don't like the reality of the answer or they're just upset when they go back and have revisionist history and look at the draft boards and like I'll use Tyrese Halliburton for example. Like they look at Tyrese Halliburton versus Killian Hayes or Desmond Bane and a Tyrese Maxey and they get upset.
Yeah, no, I mean that's what it's so you can get down a quick rabbit hole when you start looking at some of those things of the guys that could be on this roster. And it is frustrating. I understand the frustration. And that's why I think it's a big summer. There's $60 million in cap space. There's young talent, even including the number 5 pick. I know it's a quote unquote bad draft, but there are young assets on the roster. I think the more and more we talk about it, the more and more I look at it, the more I think it is time they need to go get, if they don't think it's Jaden Ivey. And in my opinion, I don't think the organization thinks it's Jaden Ivey. And so you got to find a guy that can get buckets on this team off of Cade Cunningham, and then other dudes slot into necessary roles. You don't have to build a championship roster, right? You don't have to even build a playoff roster. Give me a competent roster that makes sense.
For sure. Before we do get into the next topic, you guys, we have to hear from our sponsor today, the Game Time Ticket app.
You guys, I have to tell you about today's sponsor, the Game Time Ticket app. How exciting would it be to attend an NBA Finals game? Game Time makes getting NBA Final tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seats, and their lowest price guaranteed, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. Now, one of my personal favorite features within the Game Time app is the 360-degree angle of how close you're going to be getting to the action when you're looking to buy a ticket to an event. So let's look at the Tigers game that's going to be happening next Friday. And we have a lower baseline box seats. And as you guys can see on the screen, they're showing you how close you're getting to the action. Only 4 tickets left at this deal for $23, and it is a flash deal, so this is a very good deal if you want to go check out the Detroit Tigers take on a Central Division rival in the Chicago White Sox. Now, if you go over to the Game Time Ticket app and create an account and use the promo code CLNS, you're going to be getting $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code CLNS for $20 off your first purchase. And download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
Okay, we are back. We appreciate Game Time for sponsoring today's podcast. We appreciate CNLS Media for sponsoring today's podcast. So one of the questions next I wanted to ask you was about Trajan Langdon. Now, I don't know like how deep you and Amari kind of like got into the process with the Pobo search, but I wanted to know your opinion on the hiring, if you will, of Trajan Langdon. Was he a guy that was like really on the top of your like wish list, if you will?
Yeah, I haven't got into it a whole lot with him in terms of the process. Obviously, there was other names out there that got thrown around. Some of those names exciting. I kind of alluded to this earlier. I'm cautiously optimistic here. You know, the organizations he's been a part of, you know, we see all the talent they have in New Orleans, and he was a part of that. And so, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. Again, though, I don't know how many of those decisions Trajan Langdon made. I don't know if he had a lead scout that was in his ear about some of these draft picks who's staying in New Orleans and, you know, not coming with him to Detroit. So I don't know those things. And so I don't want to go over the top. I thought Troy Weaver was going to be a great hire. You know why? Because he came from Oklahoma City, where Sam Presti is a wizard. And I just assumed, hey, he'll bring that magic with him to Detroit. And after 4 years, we all know that wasn't the case. So I am very cautiously, but still optimistic.
Yeah, same here. I was like you. I was like, Troy Weaver from OKC. No way the Pistons are going to get a Troy Weaver. And then he gets here, and I'm excited. To your point, yeah, like OKC, or it's just like, man, like that's going to be a great hire. And like for whatever reason, it just didn't work out here. I don't know if it was too many cooks in the kitchen thing. I don't know if they didn't see eye to eye philosophy wise, but I like the fact that Trajan was a player in the NBA, played overseas, which I think a lot of people should pay attention to, because I think internationally, he's got a different eye in terms of like international players. Even hired a guy in J.R. Holden who was with him in Brooklyn, and they played in Russia together. I honestly like this hire. I like that he's younger. I like that he's not going into the room with Tom Gores and company, and it's like a know-it-all. He's basically said like, hey, like, I don't know everything. Like I might need help in this certain department of the front office. And the fact that he's teachable and wants to be coached up by people in the front office, I think is a different feeling I've had in, you know, different regimes, where like when we had Van Gundy felt like he had every answer any reporter was going to ask. And with Trajan, I feel like he's not going to say, yeah, I know every answer. I know every solution. So the problems that the Pistons are going to be facing.
Yeah, I think what I like here is, or is intriguing to me, is that he is bringing people from the Pelicans. And I think that speaks to probably the relationships he built with in that organization, but also bringing people from other organizations. Now, obviously, him and J.R. Holden have a long-standing relationship from playing together and all of that. I think another thing with him playing overseas is perhaps he just sees the game of basketball in a different way, having played in leagues overseas. And maybe he can bring some of that in terms of how he wants to build out a roster, or the way he thinks a successful roster can be built, or the way you can play the game of basketball. So again, I keep saying the same term and I will use it until I do think draft night will give us some insight. So even if we don't get I think draft night tells us more about Trajan Langdon's vision than a press conference would, to be quite honest with you. You know, you're going to get front office speak in a press conference, but if he drafts Donovan Clingan at number 5 on draft night, I think that tells us something. If he drafts Ron Holland at number 5 on draft night, I think that tells us something. If he trades number 5 on draft night, that tells us something. Doesn't tell us everything, but I think we start to get a vision of how he sees the roster, how he sees Cade, how does he see the other young guys, how close are they or how far away. So I think draft night, 12 days away at time of this recording. We're getting pretty close all of a sudden. And this is my night. I'll be live with Sam over on Game Theory. And, this is what we spend all year, working for. I think that will give us some real insight into Trajan and his vision.
Oh, for sure. To your point, I think you're 100% right. Like, you're going to get a lot of PR, like plain answers in a press conference, but draft night, you can kind of see his vision of maybe he likes those tall athletic wings with long wingspans. Maybe he's looking in the draft to possibly trade down and get some extra draft capital, or maybe a veteran player. To your point, he's not going to be talking to you directly, but you can kind of see where his brain at and where he's thinking of where the Pistons need to go, what direction they need to go in.
Yeah, I mean, because I'll just continue to use Ron Holland as an example, because I think he's the easiest one. If he drafts Ron Holland, to me, that means he's looking for an upside swing. It wouldn't be right away, but maybe looking for that secondary option off Cade Cunningham. And maybe he thinks he's not going to be able to get it in free agency. We all know how these conversations go, right? We all know that he knows whether he can trade for him more than anybody. Probably knows whether or not he can trade for Brandon Ingram right now, even on June 14th, and what he thinks about Brandon Ingram, because he was just there with him, or DeJounte Murray, or all of these other names that I think are reasonable for Detroit to acquire if they really wanted to. It would take some assets, but I think those guys are realistic compared to maybe a Donovan Mitchell. Well, I think Mitchell said he's going to sign his extension, so he's not going to end up on, Paul George isn't coming to Detroit. If Paul George hits the market or to the trade market or whatever, it's Philly, it's somebody else. It's not Detroit. But Brandon Ingram, DeJounte Murray, you may have to outbid some teams. But yeah, I think that's why a Ron Holland would be okay. Maybe he doesn't think he can star hunt in free agency or a trade. Maybe he feels like he has to in the draft.
Yeah, like I said, I personally like the hire. I think my biggest thing that I like about him is he's not a know-it-all, because we've had so many guys here that basically say, I know how to fix this franchise, and then 4 years later we're getting a new GM and a president of basketball operations. It's just a returning cycle.
I do continue to find that interesting, the way the organization went about creating a new position, hiring somebody in that position. And then, Weaver's not going to stay as the GM unless they hire his best friend as the new president of basketball operations. They offered Weaver a scouting position offside. It was interesting that it wasn't just fire Weaver, hire a new GM. I thought the whole organizational restructure was interesting, because I still don't know that we know what any of this means. What does the title actually tell you about what they do? So I just found that kind of interesting that they hired a position above him and then went from there. It was interesting to me. I don't know that it means anything. Yeah,
it's like when you have you're trying to pull a Band-Aid, but you don't want to pull it completely off.
Yes,
just to see. That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
And then when he said no to the scouting role, they just ripped it off. Like an off-site scouting role is a big, excuse my language, it's a big slap in the effing face.
Yeah,
like,
I was it was interesting that they offered him that, and especially since it was like off-site almost. It's probably not that big of a deal. Probably more of their scouts are off-site than what we even realized. It just seemed like it almost seemed like there was an emphasis on off-site scouting role, like get out of Detroit, get out of out of the room here. And I'll plug it again here. If Detroit wants to offer that position to me, I would be more than happy to interview for that position, because I'm definitely offside out here in Kansas.
Yeah, I mean, you can go to some games, you can check out some scouts. You never know.
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to talk about free agency a little bit. Who's one free agent you think could really help the Pistons? Maybe one free agent that you would target for the Pistons this summer.
So I know we've talked a lot about star hunting, right? And that not even star hunting's too big of a term. Finding a guy that can come in and get buckets and be a second option off of Cade, even if it's not perfect, it helps other guys fit into roles. But a guy that I've kind of fallen in love with that doesn't fit that is Najee Marshall. I really like Najee Marshall. And again, this is another role player, and we've kind of beat down the role player thing here, but they still are important. I think Najee is due for a step forward when he gets out of the shadow of really good players. And that's why I think that he could take another step. Is he's playing behind really good players. He's not a guy that's an eighth man because of like Herb Jones and Brandon Ingram and Trey Murphy are really good players, and there just wasn't a ton of minutes for him. I think he can really defend. He can shoot it enough. So Najee Marshall is a player I would really like to see them prioritize. Outside of, I keep going back and forth with Malik Monk. I love Malik Monk so much, and I'm trying to put just my love for his game aside and decide how much he makes sense here, because he's not a great defender. He's not even a good defender. I don't know if he's a neutral defender, but I think he can get buckets. I think he passes. I think he's an underrated passer. If you look at the stats, it tells you that. But if you watch the games, it tells you that even more. I do think that there is a role that makes sense for him. But with every one of these moves, it's like, what does it mean for this player already? What would that mean for Jaden Ivey if you brought in Malik Monk, right?
Right.
I love Isaiah Hartenstein. What does that mean for Jalen Duren? I think Nick Claxton could make some sense. Again, what does that mean for Jalen Duren? So I think it's really hard to talk about one individual player for the Pistons in the offseason, because there's so many big picture moves that have to coincide with it, if that makes sense. Like if they're going to trade for Brandon Ingram, I want to know what other moves are coming, because if you're going to make an investment in Brandon Ingram, I want to see this team really try to like really improve. Because you're going to pay that dude $40 to $50 million for the next 4 years after this upcoming season, because he's extension eligible. Yeah. And so I want to know, how else are they going to build this around to start, again, not win playoff series, but get yourself there. So
I've been on the Malik Monk train for probably a couple of months. But to your point, you said something and it made me laugh. His highlights do not match his stats.
Yes.
Because you watch a highlight reel and it seems like, oh, this guy's like a 20-point per game scorer. Yep. And then you look at the highlights and it's like, oh, only 15? Like, yep. That's kind of weird. I'm not going to have a hot take like Brandon Jennings had, saying that if Malik Monk basically had the same minutes as Donovan Mitchell, he's better than Donovan Mitchell, because I don't believe that wholeheartedly. I don't. But I do think, to your point, he's a bucket getter. Defensively, I mean, I think he's average. I'm not going to say he's like a poor defender.
Yeah, neutral's probably fair, right? Maybe we can agree on that. Neutral.
Yeah, he's average. I like the Najee Marshall name drop, because I know, because I got told that they almost actually traded for Najee Marshall before they tried to trade for Simone Fontecchio.
Okay.
So, I mean, maybe there's something there that the front office like there. I like that name, because I think he's a 3-and-D wing that they can plug and play, kind of maybe a cheaper option, if you will. Maybe go get Gary Trent. I don't know. He's younger.
I literally was looking up his stats as we were talking, because I'm like, okay, does Gary Trent actually make just as much sense as Malik Monk, right? I don't know. And maybe it comes down to price, but Gary Trent, is average 18, 17 points a game in his career, is actually a better shooter from three, just based on percentage, on not quite as much volume. I don't think he's nearly as good a passer, but if we just want a guy to come in and get buckets, that's a really nice name.
And he's young too.
Yes.
He's not too old. I think he's
25.
25. Yeah. I mean, yep. I think if you kind of look at the two guards in free agency, I mean, like, I don't really think Buddy Hield's going to come to Detroit personally. I think he's just going to go for whatever veteran team is most likely to make the playoffs and have a deep playoff run. I don't think they will go after Klay Thompson, even though he makes sense. But I mean, I think at this stage of his career, I think he's more suited. Again, like maybe like an Orlando makes sense for him. Just a team that's made the playoffs and needs more shooting. But it's really hard when you look at these free agents and you're like, so underwhelming. Like, we're not getting Paul George. We're not getting Siakam. To the Tobias Harris talk, I know fans don't like just because of what the contract may look like and kind of his performance in the playoffs. But Tobias Harris is a consistent player.
The contract is the thing with Tobias, right?
Yeah.
I'm okay with Tobias being like a plan B, plan C, and on a short-term contract, because I do think he plays a position at the forward that this team needs. But I would rather them target maybe somebody like Patrick Williams, who's a restricted free agent for the Bulls. I think there's mixed views on Obi Toppin. I kind of like Obi Toppin. He doesn't solve the defensive issues is a big thing with Obi, but I could understand Tobias. And I don't know that Tobias solves a bunch of the defensive issues either, but if you just want to get better, maybe you could give him a Bruce Brown type contract where it's a 1+1, but really it's just a 1. And I don't know that they're going to be able to fully competently spend all $65 million this offseason. What I also like is not the Joe Harrison contract, but is there a contract out there that you could bring in that's a dude that's overpaid, but is still a good basketball player? He's just not as good as what the contract says anymore. So I don't know who that name is. One that comes up a lot is Andrew Wiggins. The problem with Wiggins is it's got so many years on it is the issue with Wiggins. And some would argue, like, is he even still a good basketball player at this point? It's so sad to see. I don't know what's gone on, and I assume it's his personal life or whatever that has messed him up so mentally. So, first off, like, I just hope Andrew Wiggins is okay beyond basketball. But somebody like that, there was a name. I was going to look through the rosters real quick because there's another player I've talked about before that fit that mold.
Levine.
Yeah, Levine is another one. Levine's thing is the injuries, though, right?
Yeah.
And how many years is left on Levine's contract? 2?
I can look that up. Let's see.
He's still 3. So that's still the thing. He has a player option on the 3rd year that he probably would.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Give those numbers and see.
48 on a player option. That's like Blake Griffin-esque.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Shout out to Blake though.
I've said this. That archetype makes a lot of sense to me, though. Just a high volume scorer, floor spacer, bucket getter, all of those type of things. And is honestly why I've warmed up to Brandon Ingram a little bit. I don't think he's a perfect fit next to Cade because I think he does like to play with the ball in his hands. He likes to play in the mid-range some, but he would take pressure off in terms of scoring the ball. But yet again, you're going to probably have to commit 40 to 50 million a year to Brandon Ingram this offseason. And maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe he doesn't get that, but that sounds like what he's at least looking for.
Yeah. Like I said, I think that free agency, you look at the cap space and you look at the free agents and then Pistons fans like, dude, there's no one out there that can like really help us go from like 14 to 40 wins, which I don't think that's a realistic thing either, but
agreed.
I think there are some under the radar role players that you can fill out your bench with, get players that were like, I'll use Isaiah Livers, for example. There's going to be someone that gets overpaid that's going to fill into Isaiah Livers' role and automatically just put up points and put up production. That's what I kind of want to tell fans. Like, just because we have cap space doesn't mean we're going to use all of it in free agency. You could use a lot of it on draft night. You could use a lot of it in trades. You never really know.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're one of the more intriguing trade teams because they do have assets, young players. They have the number 5 pick. They can, if they really wanted to go in, I wouldn't advise this, but they do start to have access to future first round picks, even with all the stuff with the protections with the Knicks, that's actually getting small enough where they can avoid the step-in rule, I believe, in 29 and then would even have 31. Again, I wouldn't advise this. I'm just saying if you wanted to go straight star hunting here, I want to get your perspective on this, because one thing I've thought about and brought up is, to me, there's 8 players already on the roster this team would prioritize minutes to if they're still on the roster. So you have like the young core, the 4 in K, J.I., Asar, and Duran. But then you also have Sasser and Stewart. And then you have Fontecchio and Grimes, who you just traded for. I think because of what you've invested in all 8 of those guys, no matter how people feel about their play thus far in their careers, you don't want any of those 8 guys just straight up sitting on the bench. So how do you improve the roster? That didn't even include a draft pick. So now we're at 9. You're not going to spend $60 million on one player. And I'm not saying you can only have 10 quality players. I think we've learned that 11 or 12 would actually be ideal once you get into injuries and those type of things. My point here is I just feel like a consolidation trade is probably more on the table than I've even considered, because I don't know that you can prioritize and give the developmental minutes to all of these guys they may need.
I'll give you a hot take. I think all those players that you just named, I think only 6 will remain. I think they'll keep a bulk of the core 4, and I think they'll probably keep Sasser and Fontecchio.
Yeah, I think I'm with you.
Because that's a lot to bring back for a team that only won 14 games last season.
How do you improve? And I know people say, especially with the same coach, and in fairness to them, that they have a point here. How do you improve with the same coach unless you've completely changed his vision? But I don't know that just changing his vision of how he uses the roster changes a ton. I think it could help. But this team can't win 14 games a win again. I don't think they can win 20 games again. Like, what's the bare minimum that you're like, okay, that's at least progress? 10? Like, if they get to 24, 25 wins, we can at least, can you stomach that? I would say most fans, I think, would say no.
I could, because I'm more patient and I could see the bigger picture, but in the same breath, I don't know how Trajan Langdon feels about this core.
Yeah. No,
he could just like Cade. Like, we don't know. Like, he could say everyone else is like on the trade block. We really don't know like what his vision, what he feels about every player like on this team. Like, because spacing wise, and that's, I know it's a completely different topic. Like, spacing wise with Asar and Duran and Ivy, like, you don't really have a lot of perimeter spacing around Cade.
I like each of those guys individually. I'm probably the biggest remaining Jaden Ivey fan in the Pistons space. I just really love his rim pressure, but I understand that he doesn't work with some of these other players. Those guys don't work together. Here's the thing. I like Asar. I understand the people that are super high on Asar. I even understand the people that are super high on Duran because he is so young and the production he has had, even though I have real questions about the defense. I don't think you can play Asar Thompson and Jalen Duran together. Not for a lot of minutes anyway, because that is complete lack of floor spacing. That's not 2 bad shooters. That's 2 non-shooters right now, at least right now in Asar's career. Jaden Ivey at least makes them sometimes. Now you could say they still don't guard him, and you're probably right, but he's not a non-shooter. He's just not a good shooter. Asar and Duran are non-shooters. And so it's just, you got to hash this out in terms of who can play together. That doesn't mean you have to trade them either. My other thing is some of these guys could come off the bench and you can stagger things in a way that you can still keep them on the roster. They just don't all have to play together. And that may not mean they're not your core 4 anymore. And that's okay too. But I don't think I love the idea of a Cade, J.I., insert wing, Asar, Duran starting lineup again to start next year. That's a little bit scary to me and a little bit of a recipe for a lot of the same things we saw this past season.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Boston right now in the finals, all 5 of those guys can shoot in the starting lineup. All 5 of those guys can make a 3-point shot at an efficient rate.
Let alone the guys off the bench, right? They bring Al Horford off the bench who can shoot. And then Sam Hauser may be one of the best 5 just pure shooters in the league. And they're bringing those dudes off the bench too.
Yeah, like I said, I love Asar. I love Ivy. It's really high on Ivy coming out of the draft. But from a spacing perspective, you're playing like from 10 years ago when they had like Andre Drummond, KCP, Josh Smith, Greg Monroe. Like it's not going to work. Like,
and Duran's passing hasn't been as good as what I thought coming out of college. He's good for a big man, but it's not great or elite. JI is not the best processor. So not only do you have a lack of floor spacing, you also have a lack of like true like ball movement, connective tissue, those type of things. And then there's the defensive concerns, especially with JI and Jalen Duren as well. And I do think you need defense because Cade is maybe going to be neutral, maybe. And that's probably all we can expect with the offensive usage he's going to take. So there's just some real, some of these things just don't connect really well. And again, that doesn't mean you have to trade them. I'm not saying sell on all of these guys. I'm just saying put them in positions to be more successful. And as much as I hated it, maybe that is JI coming off the bench. Just make the starter next to Cade, not Killian Hayes, make it somebody good. And I'll feel better about it. Maybe
Sasser, I don't know. Maybe it's Sasser next time.
I just want it to be somebody really good. You know, like if it's Malik Monk, I don't know if it's great, but or Gary Trent or somebody like that, it makes a little more sense to me. So it's this offseason. I feel like we say it every year, but this has a lot of different ways to play out. So many different avenues.
Yeah, I think it's the most important offseason.
It is huge.
The last 10 seasons, because there's a lot of decisions that have to be made, and I do not envy anyone in the Pistons front office because there are going to be moves that fans absolutely hate. I already know it's going to happen. Maybe it's a favorite player of yours that's going to get moved or traded or whatever. Maybe they get their role diminished, like you said, Ivy off the bench. You never really know, but I honestly think this is going to be a really exciting offseason. There's going to be tons of, I think, player movement, a lot of free agent signings, possibly trades. But I know we went way off in left field on a rabbit hole, and I love when that happens because
I've had these organic topics are the best. You know this. You've done enough podcasts. They're the best ones, right?
Yeah, honestly. I know, like, you do a lot with Sam Vecini and draft, and I wanted to like get into draft because I think the last draft guy I had on the show was Hoop Intellect, who really good, really smart guy. Yeah. We talked about the draft. So one of my questions I wanted to ask you, it's let's say the Pistons keep the 5th pick, hypothetically.
Okay. Sure.
Who are some prospects at 5 that fans should expect the Pistons to target with that 5th overall pick?
So here's the frustrating thing, right? We've spent 50 minutes talking about a number 2 option, a guy that really gets buckets and all of these things. And I mentioned Ron Holland earlier. He's probably the only one, and there's real downside with Ron Holland. People will throw out Hamidou Diallo as a floor for Ron Holland, and they're not wrong. They are not wrong. I think Ron Holland is a real high upside, swing for the fences type guy, but there's a chance it doesn't hit. And I don't know that his workouts have been great. So I still think Risacher is the guy that you hope somehow falls to 5. And people don't like that. And I get it because he's going to fall right into what we just talked about in terms of being a role player. He is a 3-and-D role player, but he's 6'9", 6'10". I think he can really shoot it. I think he can really defend. I think that makes a lot of sense on this roster. And then you go fill the role we're talking about as a bucket getter with the $65 million in free agency and all of that. So he's a guy, I don't think he's going to be there though, for what it's worth. So I did a recent thing over on my Substack where I asked people to give me their top 5 Pistons big board without Alex Sarr and Zachary Risacher. And you know who ended up 1 by a landslide was the first guy on your graphic right there, Reed Shepherd. Yep. I was shocked. I knew he'd be high. I didn't think he would win it going away.
You know, like if you would have done that a month ago, I guarantee you it would have been a different outcome. But
probably Matas. You think it would have been Matas?
I think so. I think when I talk to a lot of Pistons fans, it's like Matas or bust right now.
Yeah.
I think there are some people. There's like people in the Cody Williams hive. There's people in the Delta Connect, Klingon, even TJ Solong. I mean, there's a lot of prospects that could be there at 5, and it scares the crap out of me.
So the next 3 were Klingon, Connect, and Matas Buzelis. So
Mm-hmm.
Shepard, and the pitch with Reed Shepard, right, is ultimate floor spacer, can take some secondary ball handling. I think he's better off the ball defensively, even though he does get a little bit ball watchy at times. I think he might struggle at the point of attack a little bit, which I would rather have someone that does that a little better next to Cade, but it is what it is there. So I was surprised. Klingon was actually first of the Pistons fans I asked. He was first. So for those that don't know what I'm referencing here, I broke it down into Pistons fans, NBA draft scouts, and then general content creators. And he won the Pistons fan vote. This was shocking to me that he was first with Pistons fans. And I don't know if that just means people are a little bit lower on Jalen Duren or what it was, but I was really surprised by that one.
I'm pulling mine up because I know I did not have Klingon in my top 5.
Yeah. No,
I did not. I had Holland, Reed Shepard, Dalton Connect, Matas Buzelis, and I went spicy and I put Khalil Ware.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Khalil Ware's, he's a really interesting, his archetype fits the modern NBA if all of those things hit. Connects was really interesting because he got only 2 first place votes, but the second least no votes. So out of 40 ballots I collected, Shepard had the most where he wasn't in the top 5 at all. Dalton Connect was actually second. It's just Connect got a ton of 3rd and 4th place votes and not very many 1st and 2nd, which to me meant Pistons fans like the idea of Dalton Connect, just not at number 5.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends how the draft order goes.
Yes.
Like we did a mock draft. I think Bleacher Report put out their mock draft and they had Matas at 4 and they had Cody Williams at 5.
Okay.
Saying that like the Spurs and the Pistons are real threats to draft him as a top 4 to 5. I guess that was like what their intel told them, which I like the idea of Cody Williams. I just question the shooting volume. That's my biggest concern because when you're only shooting maybe an attempt and a half and you're shooting 41%, like what does it look like when you're shooting maybe 5-6 times a game versus like 1.5 times a game?
1.5 attempts a game. He was 1.7. That's borderline non-shooter territory, right? No matter what percentage you're shooting it at, teams are going to go, okay, shoot it 7 times tonight and let's see how it goes. Now, the shot doesn't look broke by any means, and so hopefully he can increase the thing with Cody is he has real touch around the rim. Like he probably has the best touch of the guys in the top 10 or whatever, maybe in the entire class. And if he fills out his body, if I could talk to somebody that said, no, his frame, the way he'll fill out his body, he's just skinny right now, I would feel a lot better about him. There was a aggressive mentality that kind of I didn't love with him. Me and Sam's most recent mock, we actually executed a trade, which moved the Pistons back to 8. San Antonio traded up. I thought it was a good trade for Detroit. I had Spurs people reach out to me and thought that they didn't like what San Antonio gave up to move up there. But what it did was it was a future protected 1st round pick, top 7. So maybe it needed to be top 10 or top 12 protected or something like that. But it gave Detroit a future first to recoup some of that with that pick that's in New York, traded back to 8 and still got Dalton Connect at number 8.
I mean, yeah, if you can get assets and still get a guy that can come in right away, like a Connect, which I think Connect is the most NBA ready guy that is talked in the NBA draft lottery. I think right now he could average 10 to 12 points in the NBA. It's just how good he is offensively.
And I think the thing with Connect is a lot of people talk about him just as a floor spacer, which I think he will do. There's a chance he's a overall bucket getter. Like there's a chance Dalton Connect may go average 20 points a game in his career. Now, of course, there's a chance he doesn't, but this is a guy in the SEC who was the entire offense some games and would just go crazy. And so I think there's a chance he's a real big time scorer from 2 levels, maybe even 3 levels, because he's more athletic than what you would guess. But I think the floor is he's at least a really good floor spacer. The question is on the defensive end, right? He doesn't answer a lot of these defensive questions, but what I continue to say is most of these guys aren't going to solve all of the issues. So we've talked about a few things throughout this episode, right? They need a second bucket getter, they need floor spacing, and they need defense. That guy is not in this draft. He is nowhere to be found in this draft. You might get lucky to get 2 of those things. I think you would with Reese Shea, a guy that spaces the floor and plays defense. A lot of them, it may just be 1, And that's, again, why you have to play out the rest of the offseason to answer some of the other questions.
Yeah, when I look at Connect, and I know this is like way off topic, I see a lot of Tyler Hero.
Okay,
Like
I've seen that comp as well.
Like when I watch him, he reminds me a lot of Tyler Hero. And if you can go watch like some of Tyler Hero's like high school stuff, like that kid was just so athletic, like he's dropping like 30 points a game in high school. Like that's the same type of vibe I get with Connect. And I know some people look at the age, which I've never been a proponent of. Don't draft him because he's 22, 23. If he can play, he can play. I really don't care.
My thing with the age is it just has to be a part of the evaluation. It doesn't mean you don't draft a kid. You just have to have the context of, hey, this 23-year-old has had literally 5 more years to develop his body. How many days is that? 1,800 days or something like that?
Yeah.
They've had that many days, that many workouts, that many training sessions to get better at the game of basketball. That matters. He's had that many more days than Zachary Risache to work on his jump shot, to fill out his body, all of those things. It has to be taken into account. Now, one thing with Connect is his path to this is vastly different than a lot of guys in terms of going JUCO, low-level Division I before Tennessee. So I don't even compare him. I always use Kevin McCullough whenever I do this. Kevin McCullough has 6 years of high-level Division I basketball training, nutrition, strength training, coaching, all of those things. Connect doesn't even have that. So I do think compared to other 23-year-olds in this draft or any draft, I do give him a little bit more space for potential growth because of that. But again, you can't compare his body of work and truly just his body to other guys because there's 5 years of development compared to a lot of the guys we're talking about.
I know this is such a, I can go a lot of different ways with this topic, but I do want to kind of circle back to Modest because I think he's a player that a lot of Pistons talk about. And they talk about it not so much as basketball, presence, more of like age and stuff. I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah.
But he's not even my favorite G League Ignite prospect. Tyler Smith is.
Yeah.
I question the shooting. I know he shot 40% from 3 in high school, but that's high school. I covered, like, a lot of my job was covering G League games. So I got to see a lot of Ron Holland. I got to see a lot of Modest Pizelis. My biggest thing with him is I don't know if that 3-point shot will translate at the next level in the NBA.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have no idea. He's been one of my hardest evaluations because of that. If he could shoot, if I really believed in the jumper, he would be one of my favorite prospects because I think he's a forward. So I think he's a 4. He'll have to fill out his body and his physicality, as we've talked about. A lot of these guys do. I think he weak side rim protects. I think he can play as a low man. I think he's better defensively in general than what people would think initially. I think as a 4-man, he is a plus passer and dribbler. Not a great, but he's a plus. And I'm talking about, I continue to mention him as a 4-man and not a wing, not a 3. So think the Jeremy Grant type of role, not comparing the players. I'm just saying that type of role, like a 4-man that maybe moonlights as a 3 sometimes, but he's got to be able to shoot it. And I'm with you. I don't know that he does. I have real questions.
Yeah. I mean, getting to cover like a lot of G League games. So I got to watch like probably a bulk of 90% of the Ignite games.
Okay.
And I'm like, yeah, like he's a nice prospect. I see him more as a point forward at the next level.
Okay.
I think, he could play the power forward. I think his passing is very underrated. I think he's a good passer, but the shot is where I'm like, I don't know. I think he shot like 27, maybe 25% from 3 in the Ignite.
I think his percentage for all the questions around Ron Holland shooting, I believe that Matas actually shoots. So Matas shot 26% on 3.4 and Ron Holland shot, it did end up less, 24% on 3.3. But I mean, people really question Ron Holland shooting and it was only a couple percentage points less than Matas.
I look at Ron Holland's like jump shot. I think it's more to work with than a Matas.
I think Ron Holland's jumper looks like it could be something that develops someday. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I'm a little bit higher on a Ron Holland than I would be a Matas, just for the fact that like I have so many questions. It's not just the jump shot; it's the frame too. This is a really skinny kid. Like, can he add weight at the next level? You never really know. But I mean, you see skinny guys like Chet Holmgren and Kevin Durant just own people, but you never really know. But
Chet has to be an outlier because his practical strength compared to what it just looks like, the difference between those two things is insane. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, if he bulked up to like 250, he would just be unguardable. Like, it's insane. But I do want to stay on the draft because there has been some news recently. I believe Jonathan Givony has got a little bit of intel. Pistons don't really give a whole lot of intel for the players that they draft or come in for pre-draft workouts, I should say.
Yeah.
So there has been Jacoby Walter from Baylor and TJ Salong out of Gillette. So my question to you would be, I don't see those guys as top 5 picks. I don't.
No.
Do you believe that there is a chance that they could possibly try to trade down, given, just these pre-draft workouts with a Walter and a Salong?
I think they absolutely should be having those conversations. So we talked earlier about how this is considered a bad draft, right? And everybody says it. I like the term more that it's a flat draft. It's bad because you don't have the very, very, very top end talent in the top 3. I've said it multiple times over the last couple of weeks. I said it 6 months ago. If you took the average top 3 draft prospects of the drafts of the last 20 years and put those guys at the top of this draft, it would look like every other draft. The depth in the first round, the guys you're going to get at the end of the lottery. And so like this thing balances out to good value by the time you get to the end of the lottery in the middle of the first round. At the end of the day, that's not where we're at. Nobody looks like a number 1 pick, but that doesn't mean there aren't some quality players you could draft. And so I think people go, well, then why would anybody trade up? Well, everybody evaluates talent differently. Everybody's tier break is in a different spot. The Memphis Grizzlies are the easiest team to talk about. Whenever we did the game theory pod the other day with the draft, the mock, we got to 9. Klingon wasn't there. Like, it was just a board that didn't make sense. Klingon makes so much sense to the Memphis Grizzlies to me. So much sense. If he's there at 5 for some reason, I think they would be crazy not to make that call. And if I'm Detroit, sure, I would look into that because I can trade back to 9 and still get Connect. Maybe I get Matas at 9, but now I've also acquired a future first-round pick or a veteran quality. Maybe one of their wings is on the market or something like that. So I think they should absolutely be looking. And I think, I'm not saying it's likely. I just think the chance of teams wanting to trade up is more possible than what maybe people think because we just say bad draft, bad draft, bad draft. That doesn't mean that some scouts, GMs don't see value or say, hey, we think these 4 players are really good and we have a huge break after those 4 and we want to make sure we land one of those. What if one of those 4 drops to 5 and they feel like, hey, let's go get that guy because we have a huge tier break after that. So you just never know how teams' boards are.
To your Klingon comment, I think there are like 3 teams that I just thought off the top of my head. I think Memphis, 100% agree with you. They could use Klingon. I think Chicago
is as a replacement for Vooch eventually.
Very sneaky team, and I would not rule out OKC because they got bodied by Dallas.
Sure.
I think if they came away with the draft with the Donovan Klingon, maybe you trade down to 12, maybe you get something from OKC. They have a ton of draft picks if you want that, or maybe you're looking for one of their wings. Who knows?
Well, I mean, the one I don't know where the value lands, and that's what, like, we get crushed whenever we make these trades on value. The thing with value in the trade is it depends on what you value, what's actually there, right? I mean, if the Thunder really value Donovan Klingon and they think that would be the rebounder that takes them over the top, well, that's crazy value. So that may mean multiple draft picks. Maybe it does. I don't know, but I would want Isaiah Joe. My conversation, if I was Trajan Langdon and OKC wanted to move up with 5, I would say, okay, let's start with Isaiah Joe and then we'll move from there. And, but yeah, I mean, at 12, you're looking at guys. I think Ron Holland honestly could fall to 12. I don't think Matas does. Devin Carter, Tinjon Saloon. I think Cody Williams could be there at 12. You're talking about some big guys. If you think they need a stretch big, and Kyle Filipowski, Deron Holmes, to your point, I don't have Khalil Ware as a lottery pick, but Khalil Ware has lottery type talent and archetype of players. So like, I think there's some at 12, there are still dudes on the board that would be exciting for me, especially if you know you're essentially going to get a role player type anyway.
And I think the Isaiah Joe, the marketing would write itself.
Yeah.
I mean, Isaiah Thomas, Joe DiMarzio, you're getting a guy that so underrated when he got drafted, didn't really do a whole lot in Philly, goes to OKC, and he just shot lights out. Like those are the types of players we're talking about at the top of the podcast, where you need a bucket getter, you need a guy that can, make 3-point shots. He's exactly what the Pistons are looking for.
And maybe you take a little bit of a swing on, maybe there's more there than what we even know. And he's, because Oklahoma City is so talented, you give him a bigger role and he comes in. I'm not saying he's the second leading scorer. Like, I'm not saying that, but maybe there's even more with him. I also, again, like with Malik Monk, Isaiah Joe is one of my favorite players in the league. So I probably overvalue him.
No, he was a guy that I remember. I believe he was a second round pick. I was like, just go get him. I think he could be a guy that the Pistons draft. But for whatever reason, our second round picks, like, we just don't really take it seriously. Like some of the guys we drafted in the second round, you're like outside of like Garza, like off of recent memory, like we really have not valued second round picks under Troy Weaver's tenure. And
that's one area where he didn't win on the margins. Was there was none of those free agent signings or undrafted free agents, two-way player, none of those guys hit over the past 4 years. It seems like that I can think of. Maybe I'm missing somebody. And you would like to think over a 4-year stretch, at least one of those guys would either turn into a rotation player for you or somebody that you flip for an asset that then became something else. Right. I mean, I don't know, like that's hard to do, but you would like to think that you would be able to do it, once or twice in a 4-year stretch, 5-year stretch.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. So we're going to stick with the draft. And I thought this was a fun little topic, as we're probably going to have different answers. I want to know, who's your favorite prospect in this upcoming draft? Who's just your guy that you can't stop talking about?
Deron Holmes II. And everybody knows it by now, so they all ask me about him. And then I sit here and rant and rave about how good he is. And then it sounds like I'm trying to convince people to also like him. That is not my motive here. All of my content creation, whether it's Pistons or otherwise, is just to give people my opinion. You can agree or disagree. I'm not trying to force my opinions on you or act like I'm smarter than anybody else, because I'm not. And it's the same thing with the draft stuff. I just really like Deron Holmes. I understand people who don't, and I'm not trying to convince anybody to like him. I just like to give people my perspective, and they can take it or whatever. I like to talk ball. So Deron Holmes, I think he can dribble, pass, shoot. I think he can defend. I think he can catch lobs. I think he's going to be a really, really good big in the NBA.
I was watching some highlights of him the other day, and I'm like, how is this guy not in lottery talks? Like, why am I seeing him at the end of the first round? Like, I'm going to ask you, like, why is he not in lottery talks? I don't get it. Like, I watched him. I was like, okay, he could shoot. He can block shots. He's athletic. Like, see a little bit of Naz Reid in there. Like what? Like,
I like it. I like the comp. It's interesting.
Like, I don't get it. Like, he should be in those same conversations in at least the late lottery.
I mean, the ESPN had him in the 50s recently, and then all of a sudden there was some like rumors or something about whether he got because he's had a weird draft cycle in terms of workouts, and there's like a theoretical promise or, whatever. Like, there's a lot of mystery around him. And then all of a sudden he was in the first round for ESPN even. And so I don't know. It's going to be really, I have no idea what his draft range is right now. He could end up in the lottery for all I know. He could end up at the end of the first round still, but he has been my guy through a lot of this. I've really enjoyed watching him play. And again, I'm not saying the Pistons should go out and get him. I do think he could make sense in Detroit, and I don't think they should take him at 5 or something like that. It was the same way. Benedict Mathurin was my guy in that draft class. I wasn't asking anybody to love him also. Whenever I think of my guy, it's guys that are aesthetically pleasing to watch, and Deron Holmes' game is aesthetically pleasing for me to watch. And I think he's the archetype that we've seen in the NBA really, really creates advantages for teams with bigs who can space the floor.
Yeah, like when I watched him, I was just like, man, they want to do that too big like lineup stuff. He would like him and Khalil Ware would make so much sense because they can both stretch the floor, protect him a little bit. Khalil Ware's motor concerns me though, but where Deron Holmes doesn't. Which I think I think he's a better player. Like when I watch him,
I would agree.
So probably my guy is Cody Williams.
Okay.
Just because I look at the wingspan, I look at the frame, and I'm thinking if he's anything like his brother, and they take a swing for a guy like that, and he develops his man body, you know, gets like around 200 pounds, and he's got that 7'1" wingspan. You got him and Asar out there on the wings. That would be a defensive nightmare for opposing offenses. I don't know where he's going to go. I've seen him as high as 5. I've seen him as low as like 15. Like he's all over the place. But I mean, that's probably my guy. And I've been watching a lot. People have been like putting me on him. I was just like, I don't know. I think it's going to be modest. And then the closer I get to it, I change like who I want the Pistons to take every day. Like today it's Cody Williams. Tomorrow it's probably going to be Donovan Clingan. Like I'm just all over the place.
I've been all over the place myself because sometimes I'm like, they need to space the floor. And then other times I talk my into Steph Castle because he can really defend and be a connector, even though he can't shoot. And people talk me into him. And Cody Williams is interesting. I've been a little bit lower just because the mentality does concern me a little bit. You know, he wasn't super aggressive all the time in college. How does that then translate to the NBA? But maybe he's not in a role in the NBA where that ends up mattering. You mentioned the 3-point volume, but he has real two-way potential in terms of being an impactful defender. I talked about the touch earlier in the episode. So I'm a little bit lower, but I don't hate it at all. Like we all have to have our guys for a reason. And I don't hate that Cody Williams is yours. And I would guess he's truly, I don't want to say in play. Like I have no idea what the Pistons big board looks like, but like if they took Cody Williams at 5, it wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me if they took Stephon Castle either, because
for sure.
I know some people are talking like, well, this changes things now that we have this like shooting guru. Like we're gonna take Ron Howland, we're gonna take Stephon Castle because he can just make their shot like better. I was like, I don't know, man. Like that's a whole other avenue that that could be a podcast in itself of who are the Pistons going to take now that they're bringing in the shot doctor. I don't know. Like, honestly, man, I just love this time of year. I get way too excited about all these prospects. And then like, I hang my hat. Like last year was Cam Whitmore. Like, I was like banging the table for Cam Whitmore. And then Houston gets every player I want. It pisses me off every year.
And listen, this is no knock on Asar at all. We've seen how good Asar can be, but Cam Whitmore, what we saw in his rookie year in the time he got, like you could use a guy that can get some buckets the way Cam Whitmore does. So, I still don't know that we know the whole story of why I don't think it was talent related is why he ended up at 20. I don't know what the intel was that happened there, but
I don't know. It's like, why does the coach talk crap about a player? And then you hear like knee injuries. Knee looked fine to me. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, man. Like this time of year, you hear just a bunch of like crazy stuff. Maybe it's agent talk. Maybe their agents don't want them to go to a certain team. Sure. But I mean, this draft talk this time of year is a lot of fun. But do you have time for maybe like 1 or 2 Q&A questions from people that are watching right now?
Yeah. If they tuned in, absolutely.
For sure. We got 700 people in here right now.
Let's go.
They're definitely like love listening to you and just your analysis of like all these prospects and the Detroit Pistons. So this is a question from Nick Brink. Thoughts on AJ Johnson? He's been training with Jalen Green for years, looked good in the combo scrimmage, good score, and probably a better dishing setup. Jalen Green to point out the dish decayed.
Yeah, AJ Johnson's really interesting. I wonder where he ends up going. I've heard some first round buzz for him. He's very, very talented. For those that don't know, he played over in the NBL, so the same league as Alex Sarr, but didn't play a whole lot of minutes over there. That league, it's just hard. Like if you look up Alex Sarr numbers, you'll see that he didn't get a ton of minutes as well. So through all of it, he averaged less than 10 minutes a game. So the film, the numbers is a little bit tough. I will say that when the first game I turned on, I was like, he just has a juice to his game and a pace that stood out immediately upon turning on the film. Like he just moved different, creative handle, separates, You bring up the passing in the question, showed some passing flashes that were intrigued. I have some questions about the defense. I have some questions around the frame. My very initial notes said first round pick, like uppercase, first round pick in 2025. And now it seems like he's going to be, they used to use the term pre-draft, where you draft a guy this class because you know you're not going to be there to draft him in 2025. It sounds like that's probably going to happen with AJ Johnson. So very interesting prospect.
I haven't watched a whole lot of NBL. The only time I'd really watched a lot of NBL was when LaMelo Ball was over there, because I really wanted the Pistons to draft him, but they kind of got hosed in that draft because of COVID. But
yeah.
This is a question. I know we're talking about Ingram, and this is from someone over on Twitter. Thoughts on a possible starting lineup of Cade, Ivy, Ingram, Duren trade, Thompson, Jonas Valanciunas free agent.
So trade Duren for Ingram and then sign Jonas Valanciunas. Okay. So Cade, Ivy, Ingram, Thompson, Jonas.
No spacing again.
That's my thing. I think it's more talented, right? Like you have a real NBA scorer in Brandon Ingram. You have a real NBA big in Jonas. My other thing with Jonas is I don't know how much of a defensive upgrade Jonas is over Jalen Duren. I don't know how much Jonas can move anymore in that situation. Like he's big and physical in a way, so he is impactful defensively. Like he's better than Duren defensively, but I don't. There's still some spacing concerns there for me. I like the talent overall, though.
The one thing I'll say about Jonas is I think for teams that are going to target him, it's consistency. He's a consistent player. He'll give you a good 15 to 10 and play 70 games a year.
Yeah.
I honestly think I'm higher on Duren than maybe most. I think it's a lot of people that have these takes of trading Duren. He's 20 years old. Like, if you want to go out and sign Hartenstein, fine. Iron sharpens iron. Let those two guys go out and practice every day. And, tell Duren, like, hey, you want to start? Well, we just signed Hartenstein. Go beat him out. Like, I think that's what they need to do. Go get a veteran center. I don't know. Honestly, I think that a Jonas Valanciunas to the Pistons doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because he seems like a center that you get when you want to compete to get to that next level. And I don't think the Pistons are at that stage of where they're at right now. I think they need a little bit more younger, but you still want to upgrade the talent. But I don't really think you go out and sign a Jonas. I think he goes to like maybe LA or more of a veteran team.
So I just pulled up some of my Jonas notes from throughout the season when I watch Pelican games. Extremely physical presence, right? He's going to dominate the offensive boards, but really we have Duren doing that already. He has size, the strength, he can test shots, but one of the note that stands out to me is you can really see the movement limitations with Valanciunas. And that's where I'm talking about defensively. Maybe he's better contesting shots at the rim, but I think you lose something with his movement. And then even if you just look at the numbers over his last 3 years, they have slowly gone down. And so, one of the big things with Jalen Duren is he doesn't block a lot of shots.
Yeah.
Jonas Valanciunas doesn't average a block per game in his entire career.
Yeah.
Overall, he's had a few years earlier in his career where he did that. So that's what I'm saying. I don't know how much of a defensive upgrade that is. The big thing for Valanciunas is the rebounding, which Duren does. And then maybe you get a little bit of floor spacing. But again, while he can shoot threes, he's not a guy that does it on crazy volume.
Yeah, I think if they were to go out to get a center, I think Nick Claxton would probably be more of the center that the Pistons are looking for. Because if you look at Claxton, like 2 blocks a game, I think that's what would probably be more appealing. And if you get Nick Claxton, it's probably a sign and trade. You're probably
and you still get the lob threat, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I'm really high on Duren. Obviously, this past season defensively, I think was a red flag in terms of you just didn't see a consistent work ethic around the rim. And he's the type of center where I think he's capable of blocking 2 shots a game. I just do. He's got the physical tools, but maybe it's the ankle injuries. Maybe it's I don't know. Coaching changes. Who knows?
I would like to see one more year. I would like to see a year, and maybe it doesn't play out that. Maybe you have to make a move this offseason, but it would be great to get one more year of evaluation to see if he can develop that defensive end of the court.
Yeah, I don't think they have to make a move right now.
Yeah.
I think he's still under rookie contract. You can see what's there.
I just meant if there was a bigger move that he had to be included in.
Yeah, I think, like I said, you got to be a little bit more patient with him. Only 20 years old, but I do want to give you the floor to plug and promote yourself. You can plug and promote yourself as much as you want, man. I don't care. You can promote everything. So people can find you, follow you, keep up with all the work that you do, because I know you're a very busy guy doing podcasts and writing articles.
Yeah, just again, follow on Motor City Hoops at Twitter. That's the best place. Again, I've had to learn in my old age that I have to self-promote over there. And so anything I put out content-wise, scouting reports, the little project I did with the Pistons big board and all of that, it's all there. And then anytime I'm on a podcast, I always quote tweet and all of that. And I want you to know, I value this so much. We were talking about it before we recorded, but when people ask me on, I always try to say yes and make it time for it, because I love doing it. And I know how important that is to people's podcasts to be able to bring on guests and keep things different and fresh. So I always appreciate people asking me on and really enjoy it, and thank all of the listeners for supporting it. So thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun here, and it's going to be a really interesting rest of the off season.
Yeah,
I guess we're not even officially in the offseason. There's a couple of teams that are still playing basketball, and we feel like we're 2 months deep into the Pistons offseason.
I just want to say this has been the most boring finals I've ever watched.
Oh, man.
It's going to be a sweep. Boston's going to win it. But again, if you guys do want to keep up with Bryce, follow the Pistons Pulse podcast on the Detroit Free Press. There should be a link in the description to go subscribe to the Free Press. There should be a link to his Twitter if you guys want to go follow him there. Keep up with his Substack. He did ask me to do like a pre-draft thing, and I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh wow, maybe I should be higher on Donovan Clingan, and I wasn't.
No, man, that's this draft, man. It's there's no judgments. There's no. I did that, and I think 15 different players ended up between 40 ballots. And 15 different players were represented, and all I asked for was 5 names. And so I think that tells you a lot about where things are at right now.
I set my top 5 because I was like, oh, so what do you think of this top 5? They're like, man, you got to stop eating those gummies. Like, I was like, really? He's like, how is Clingan not in your top 5? I was like, I don't know. I like Duran. He's like, dude, like, we're gonna draft Clingan. Watch. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm crazy.
Yeah, no, it's there's options there. They got to find the right one. So,
all right, you guys, we appreciate all 720 you guys watching it 5:00 in the afternoon. Appreciate all of you guys watching on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We will catch you guys next week. Hope you guys are staying safe.